This morning, we're focusing on major crises that teenagers and children face. According to the CDC, the proportion of mental health-related emergency department visits rose more than 30% in kids 12 to 17 years old during the first months of the pandemic in 2020. And there was a more than 50% increase in emergency department visits for suspected suicide attempts among adolescent girls during 1 month period in 2021 compared with 2019. Jamie Howard is a senior clinical psychologist from the Child Mind Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to children's mental health. Good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So what are some warning signs that parents can look out for when it comes to depression in children and teens?
With depression, what we want to look for is some mood changes, like depression shows sadness and irritability. Irritability more than sadness sometimes with kids. So that's something to keep in mind. Changes in eating or sleeping and loss of interest or motivation in doing things that you used to enjoy doing.
You know, now, I want to ask about irritability because it seems like teenagers are always irritated with something. Oftentimes parents, because we don't know what we're talking about. What's the difference between a teenager just being a teenager and then as a parent thinking, you know, I need to dig a little bit deeper into what's going on?
Right, so there's usually some functional impairment, which means when kids are really irritable, they're like pushing friends away, they're pushing family away. It's not just a momentary kind of thing, it's kind of sustained and frequent.
Let's talk about anxiety as well, because in addition to depression, anxiety is racking kids in this generation. What are some of the warning signs to look for there?
So with anxiety, what we want to look for is sudden onset of avoidance of things that kids usually did sort of comfortably, right? Like going to school. Suddenly they don't want to go to school and it's unclear why, and they might be really sort of rigid about not wanting to do that. Maybe that's something like social anxiety. They're suddenly afraid of being embarrassed. We also want to look for changes in our physical bodies. So like increased heart rate, nauseousness, sort of like complaints about our physical wellness.
Yeah, that's another tricky one for adolescents, right? Because one day they wake up and they may not feel good in that shirt anymore or whatever. So how do you know when it's a crisis and when it's just run-of-the-mill adolescent bumps?
So again, like with all illnesses, what we want to look for is this functional impairment. So kids need to go to school. So if the anxiety is keeping them from going to school, that's a very important job that they have. That's when we want to say, we have to help you with this because you need to function. You need to be able to get out the door and do your important things.
What's your advice, Jamie, to parents who may be concerned about their kids who they think could be contemplating suicide or who appear to be very depressed? Yeah. What should parents do or say in that situation?
So you want to ask very directly. Are you thinking about hurting yourself? Are you thinking about killing yourself?
That always seems awkward, though, because you think that are you planting a seed or is it seems like an very volatile question to ask.
Right.
But all the experts we've talked to say you have to be that direct about it.
You want to be really direct. And you want to say it in a calm, empathic way. So it's not like an accusation. Yeah. It's an extension of a conversation. I've noticed you haven't been feeling like so good lately. You haven't seemed like yourself. And then you open up a conversation. Have you been thinking about killing yourself? Is that part of it? And then if the child says yes, but just sometimes it feels like it would be easier not to be here, that's what we call suicidal ideation. And you want to get your child to a mental health practitioner right away. If they say yes, and I have a plan, so you want to ask, that's the second question, do you have a plan? Have you thought about what you would do? Then that becomes more of an emergency, and we want to contact 911 potentially if they have a plan and a desire, a strong intention to die. You can also call the National Suicide Helpline, 273-TALK, because they can help you sort that out if you're having a hard time as a parent.
Are there certain ages that you think are more vulnerable or more susceptible to this? Is it boys or girls, or is there an age?
It's girls and teenagers are more likely to die by suicide, and the rates are going up steadily over the past decade and a half, even before the pandemic.
Why is that? Why is that? Girls, I mean.
So there's a few different hypotheses about it. Part of it is the developing brain and the changes with onset of puberty, and part of it is a sociological explanation of some of the pressures of being a young girl.
Yeah.
I'll take this moment to have some transparency, full transparency on the show. After you visiting us, I told myself I'm going to go home and I'm going to ask a very direct question, which is about suicide to my kids, which we communicate a lot, but it's a question that I've never asked. So I walked in my house, my heart was racing like never before. I mean, I played in football games, we're on this show, we have some very high stakes moments. I've never had more anxiety or nervousness as a parent. So I walked up to my kids and I went down the line, and they all answered very honestly. And my daughter said something that she never said to me before. She said, You know, I've never thought about committing suicide, but I noticed when my brothers are injured because of sports, they get more attention. And I didn't know that. And I bring this up because if we wouldn't have had this conversation, I wouldn't have walked in and learned that small detail about my daughter. And having a little bit more peace of mind knowing my daughter doesn't have suicidal thoughts. So for parents who might be nervous about that first conversation, because for a lot of parents, it is the first conversation. How do they hype themselves up to do it?
So you don't have to actually feel calm. You just kind of want to fake it as best you can.
That's good advice.
And you can rehearse it ahead of time. Have
That's
sort
what
of
I
a
did.
script. Take some deep breaths, right? Like slow, steady belly breathing actually really helps to reduce our anxiety. And then you can have an opener. Like, I was watching the news this morning, and these people were talking about this, and I thought, well, I haven't asked you. And then you can use that as the opener.
Hey, that's great.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jamie. We appreciate
Really good
you.
advice.
That is very good
Valuable
advice.
information. All right. If you or someone you know is seeking mental health resources, you can call the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline at 1-800-950-6264. In a crisis, you can text NAMI to 741-741.